Great. So you'll see that some of what I plan to say goes over some of the same territory that Jackson did. So I'll go pretty quick through this. As he mentioned, we hope these slides are useful when you think about whether or not you want to make comments on this process. One of the hopes for this forum was to help people think about the kinds of comments they want to make, because it really is important that the governor and the Energy Planning Board hear from everyone what they think about this. At the back of the room, I have a whole stack of my cards. If anyone would like my slides, just grab one of those cards, shoot me an email. I'm happy to send it off to as many people as you want. You can distribute it. All of the references are in the base bottoms of all these slides here. So I've got sort of three main takeaways. You've got them summarized in one of your handouts. I kind of view it as the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm going to go with the good, the ugly, and the bad, just for a little variation. As Jackson said, the 80% reductions by 2050 is an important goal to have reiterated by the state. It is complicated, though, by their mixing these various elements, and I would say that you could quite a bit simplify this by eliminating not only the references specifically to CO2, but this idea of CO2 intensity. As Jackson kind of very clearly pointed out, we've decoupled the GDP, our production in the state, from CO2. So this focus in the plan on how much CO2 there is per economic activity is really not a very useful metric anymore. And even without doing anything, it's going down in the state. So it really isn't a good metric to measure how well the plan is moving us towards the future. Elsewhere in the plan, it references greenhouse gas emissions, which is this much larger suite of gases. And it would be much simpler and much more effective to use that one metric. The other piece is that this is, of course, living within the whole host of other energy-related pieces the state has already looked at. In 2009, then Governor Patterson issued Executive Order 24 here, and it explicitly makes this 80 by 2050 commitment. And it makes clear that it's greenhouse gases that we have to worry about, which is really the thing. And I wanted to mention just a little bit about how these inventories are done, because without having seen their methodology yet, we don't know what they're going to plan. But if we look at a standard greenhouse gas inventory, they're done by what they call scopes. So scope 1 is sort of everything that you directly control, everything that's burned and whatnot within your region. Scope 2 is all of the stuff that sort of obviously should be connected to you. You consume electricity, so you should count the emissions from the production of that electricity. And so this is why the plan focuses on these combustion of fuels. Where we have questions, though, is when you get to scope 3, which is really important. Particularly when we talk about natural gas. And scope 3 emissions are where you take a more holistic approach, what's often called a life cycle or cradle to grave approach. You have what are called embodied emissions upstream of power plants, embodied emissions in fuels. Often this is how much energy it takes to get the fuel out of the ground. So if you're thinking of unconventional tar sand oil, all of the energy and greenhouse gas emissions from mining and processing. For natural gas, though, this becomes very important when you talk about methane leaks. Yeah. Right. And Jackson mentioned the need for interim goals. So the earlier you have your targets, the more time you have to set corrective actions. It's also important to realize that, again, there's this whole universe of energy-related initiatives in the state. And one of the big ones, certainly for the state-controlled agencies, is that they already have a 2020 goal for a 20% reduction in the energy use per square foot for all state-controlled buildings. This, of course, is a particularly important one for SUNY because all of our buildings are under this. But having a 2020 goal would connect to some of the things Governor Cuomo has already wanted to do. And as I said, the earlier you set this interim goal, the more time you have to make corrective actions. So at the end here, I sort of cap each one. So we have a good plan, right? The 80 by 50 is a good goal. That if you want to take one thing that really is positive about the plan, it gives us a target that we want to get to. Now it's simply a question of making sure the plan actually can get us there. And we want to make sure that when we think of that 80%, we're not leaving out any of the energy-related pieces that are important. Now, with respect to natural gas, the reference case, we'll talk about that. What I want to mention here, though, is the sort of question of whether or not the plan is actually calling for an increase in hydrofracking in New York. It is really explicitly recognizing that any increase in natural gas is going to come from shale somewhere. And if we're concerned about hydrofracking, it really should be anywhere, not just here in New York. And so irrespective of what happens in New York, when you look through the plan, you'll find places like this, right? Regardless of actions within New York, sufficient supplies of gas are likely to be available for us to make any of these increases in natural gas use we use. So if any increase in gas remains in the final plan, it is very likely to come from shale. This is just a consequence of where the resources are. This is the projections from the Energy Information Administration. It's also cited in the plan. You can see this line here is sort of the last data point. And as we go forward, roughly 90% of any future increase in gas production is projected to come from shale formations. Already we've gone in just over a decade from about 2% of gas production being from shale up to over a third. And if this sort of business as usual goes forward, that would increase to more than half of all production by 2040. And this is being driven in large part by states like Pennsylvania. If you look, that blue line there is conventional gas. The red line is the production from the shale formations. And you can see that essentially all of the increase in production over this time period has come from shale. And in fact, Pennsylvania has increased so dramatically that it's gone from just a tiny fraction, 0.5% or so, all the way up to about 1/4 of all U.S. shale gas production. So it's a major source. And the plan, again, contains a number of these references where it says, well, we don't really know whether or not hydrofracking will be allowed in New York, but irrespective, as long as we build the pipelines, we can get the shale gas from somewhere and get it into New York. And if we're concerned about this kind of production, it really should care. We should care whether it's here or in Pennsylvania, just across the border. And so I think the plan really should be focused a lot more on the fact that any increase in gas is going to come from this type of production. And even if you set aside all of the other issues associated with hydrofracking, just from the plan's own goal of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, it is a very troubling fact that it doesn't seem to include these Scope 3 emissions, at least not in any of the discussions that were obvious from the plan. And they would include methane leaks. And methane leaks are very important from shale gas because methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And therefore, even relatively minor amounts of leakage very significantly increase the production. You might recognize one of the names here on our citation. Right. And in the plan, there is reference to the need to deal with methane leaks. In fact, Initiative 9, one of those 15 initiatives in the glossy Volume 1 of the plan, it expressly references the need to reduce leaks of significant magnitude. As a scientist, my first question is, what is significant magnitude? Without a number, that's hard to really say is much of a goal. The bigger issue comes, though, when you look at periodically throughout the plan how leaks are defined. It defines them in the transmission and distribution system, not at production. And so the plan should expand the definition of leaks to really take this whole cradle-to-grave approach to natural gas. And so if you remember those Scope 3 emissions, embodied emissions in fuels, that's sort of the poster child for methane leaks here in shale gas. And so our takeaway here, sort of the ugly for the plan, is that it should recognize that any increase in natural gas that it predicts as a consequence of its overall strategies would very likely come, at least in very large part, from shale gas somewhere. And if it does, then it should really take into account the full Scope 2 and 3 emissions so that it can determine whether or not that increase in gas usage is in any way compatible with its 80% reduction goal. So we get to the last piece, which is this, the fact that there really is no model here. There really is not much of a plan to the plan. What we see when we look at it is that entire first volume, that 70-page glossy brochure that was mentioned, it's full of the 15 initiatives. You have the summary of them in your handouts here. And nowhere in those 900 pages of appendices is there any attempt to model the impact of those 15 initiatives and clearly say these initiatives and these dollars will represent this kind of savings, and to actually see how we can move forward. As Jackson said, the appendices mainly reference these reference cases and then sort of qualitatively describe alternative cases without connecting them back to those 15 very clear, very concise initiatives that the plan is proposing. The reference cases are principally from NYSERDA and EIA, so as reference cases, they're perfectly reasonable. But they don't actually allow us to determine how it is that we're going to connect a plan to get us to those 80% reductions. And in fact, when we look at the plan, it's often that there are apparent inconsistencies as we look through it. So you look at the reference cases, for instance, this is one example that was pointed out to me. You go to the reference case for electricity, and as Jackson pointed out, big increases in natural gas, other things. It actually, under the reference case, would have a substantial increase in greenhouse gas emissions. They predicted about a third. There's then no subsequent discussion that just sort of ends there. There's no discussion of how it is that those 15 initiatives and all the other elements of the plan would take that 33% increase and turn it into the kind of reduction that we would need. As a result, there's really no way to judge if those initiatives described in the plan and the other elements discussed are really sufficient. And of course, the next piece is to look at the renewable side. And we have the fact that when serious looks have been taken at New York's energy system, it's very likely that those potential renewable targets that Jackson pointed out, those really are likely to be quite conservative, that there really is the potential to push even further than the plan appears. You have a couple of examples of those in terms of what is possible. And you can see the reference cases have very small increases in renewable production. And in fact, if you look at primary energy, it's one of the complicating factors. There's electricity, and then there's primary energy, which includes heating and transportation. Jackson's slides looked mainly at electricity for some of those numbers. These look at the same projections, but from total energy consumption. And in that case, it actually turns out to look quite a bit worse. Under total primary energy, the percentage that comes from renewables would actually shrink by 2030 because the overall consumption of energy would go up faster than their renewables would. And so they actually decrease over that time. The increases in coal and natural gas are quite dramatic. One of the most recent places where someone has taken a look very closely at New York specifically, this is the famous Jacobson paper that has gotten quite a bit of attention. The Solutions Project, the handout from New York, is included within your handouts here. If you haven't had a chance to look at this website, it's a very nice website because it took each of the states and looked at what mix of renewable resources do they have available to them. This is the slide here for New York that you have reproduced. I wanted to show you just briefly what the kinds of things that an actual plan, as I am describing it, might look like. These are slides that are drawn from SUNY Cortland's Climate Action Plan. Cortland has adopted this plan 3 years ago, and we update the plan every 2 years, which is comparable to what Jackson showed. Every 2 years you have a target that you're attempting to make, and you can then make real-time corrective actions. This is what's called a wedge model, where you have transportation, electricity, heating, food, and we look at very specific models for how much could we save out of each one. Each wedge blows up into its own individual piece. So we have an efficiency wedge, how much can we get from efficiency in any given year, solar thermal, biomass, ground source heating. The campus has made targets for all of the technologies and showed an actual pathway to get from where we are today to what would be an 80% reduction by 2050. We have interim targets along the way. You can see ours is maybe a little wibbly wobbly there. We start out slow, go fast in the middle, and end up slow at the end. But these kind of wedge models are very common. They were first widely proposed by a group at Princeton in 2004, and are really a kind of standard way that people model the impact of different initiatives. The nice thing is your model spits out an annual cost. We know what it is we're expected to have to pay as a campus. It turns around because eventually we start saving money from all of the efficiency and renewables pieces. But in any given year, we know, are we on target for making our reductions, or are we not? And then in 2 years down the road, we redo all the numbers so that everything stays current with technology. This is the kind of thing that we would like to see, so that we would know, are those initiatives spending money in a way that will have the kind of impact that we really want? And so our third takeaway here is really that we want to see that kind of modeling. That entire front volume really doesn't have a lot of connection to the back. I will close because I would be remiss as a member of SUNY without pointing out that one of my favorite initiatives is number 15 here. They do want to spend more money on education. For those who might be interested, I will shamelessly plug our new program. Just this year, we have started a new master's program in sustainable energy systems, hoping to begin to train people to help expand the sustainable energy workforce here in Tompkins County. Anyone interested, website is here, and we have handouts at the back as well. And with that, I will turn it back over.